Hi, it's Sherri from A Quilting Life, and I'm here today to talk about hand stitching binding. Now, I've already made two other binding videos, binding part 1 and binding part 2, that walk you all the way through the process of sewing your binding to your quilt by machine. If you watch those two videos, they actually take you all the way to this step where you're ready to start stitching by hand, and I didn't demonstrate that in either one of those videos. So I get a lot of emails and a lot of questions, and I thought today that we'll go ahead and just finish that to completion, and I'll show you how I do the hand stitching for my bindings and a couple tips and tricks that I have used over the years that seem to really help. So let's get started. Okay, so what we're starting out with for today's tutorial is a quilt that is finished, quilted, and I've already stitched the binding on by machine. So I'll show you just so that you can see that I haven't attached it to the back of the quilt yet. It was just sewn on by machine, as you'll see in my binding video part 2. So what I do after I do that, and I think I did show this part in that video, is I press it with an iron so that I have a really nice crisp finish right here. And then I always go ahead and I clip my entire project with Wonder Clips. I really like Wonder Clips. I space them, I don't know, anywhere from 1.5 to 2 inches apart. I like having them close together. I have this little binding bag I keep with me where I put the clips in. So I can just take this with me, set it on the table or chair where I'm hand stitching, and just drop the clips into here as I finish using them. I also have a pair of scissors in here, a neutral thread, and a little package of the Primitive Gatherings binding needles that I really like to use. I try to also keep a couple needles threaded on the inside of the bag. So for this quilt, and this was actually a work in project that wasn't finished, so it was kind of good to get it out of my closet and get a binding put on it for this video today. I think part of the reason I never finished this was I couldn't decide on binding, and so if I had put a more neutral color for these little squares, I probably could have just used one dark color to frame it, but because this was so bold, I felt like anything else, it was just really hard to decide. So I went ahead with a scrappy binding, and you can watch my scrappy binding tutorial. I had some of these strips already made, and I just alternated green, blue, green, blue, green, blue. So that kind of brought in all the greens and blues that were already in this quilt, and I'm really happy with how that worked. It is a wall hanging, and so I did do the little pockets. You can see how I did those in my video on how to hang a mini quilt. I just slip a dowel in there, and there's more directions in that other video. But anyway, I'm just going to start and show you what I do, and there are a couple of little tips that I have for going around the corners, and so we're going to just show a close-up of me hand stitching. For scrappy bindings, I try to use a neutral thread that will blend in with most of the fabric colors. I feel like I don't want to have to stop and change thread color as I'm binding. So for this, I had this kind of taupey gray that really, seemed to kind of blend in with most of my colors. It really blends in with the greens and the darker blue. But so anyway, I'm using this for thread, and I've got a needle already threaded, and what I do is I've got a knot already in the end of my thread, and I'll show you what I do. I'm just going to come up through the edge of the binding so that knot is hidden underneath the binding. Okay, so I've got that knot right there. I guess I started a little bit too far back. But then what I do is where I've come up from the binding, I take a tiny stitch in the back of the quilt right below that, and then I go about 1/4 of an inch up and come up close to the edge of the binding. So I'm just going to take these stitches all the way to the corner. Because I do something a little bit different at the corner, and that was actually one of the primary reasons I wanted to film this video, is to kind of show you what I've come up with for the corners. And I actually don't remember if it was my grandmother that taught me this. I just can't remember. I've been doing it for so long, but I think it must have been my grandmother who told me how to do this. Either that or in a class somewhere. When if you have a quilt hanger of any kind, I just stitch to the, I take one stitch where I go into the quilt back and up through the quilt sleeve or quilt hanger. And then from here on out, I won't worry about getting my needle all the way down through the quilt. I'll just make sure that it goes through that little pocket. Okay, so I'm getting close to the corner, and this is where I'm going to show you what I do at the corners. And I feel like one of the reasons I started doing this too is that when my kids were little and they had quilts, sometimes the bindings would come apart and I would have to restitch them where I had hand stitched them. That kind of taught me to take smaller stitches, you know, to keep it. This one, I'm probably, it looks like I'm about 3/8 of an inch apart, but this is a wall hanging. It's going to go on the wall. It's not going to get a lot of use. I feel like I can have my stitches a little bit further away. If I'm making a quilt for a child or a baby, or even for an adult that's going on a bed and is going to get a lot of use, I'm going to tighten those stitches up to about 1/4 of an inch away. But on this, you know, this is going on my wall, so, okay. So I always keep a binding clip right at the corner. Let me show you again how I fold that. I feel like I showed this in that other video, but just in case, I fold one side all the way to the end, and then I do a diagonal fold, and I make sure that the end of that they meet. So it's a real miter. And as I mentioned, when I go around and clip all of the entire quilt, I make sure that those are mitered and are, you know, just really crisp and nice. When I get close to that, I have to take the clip out, but I hold it with my finger. I actually take a few extra stitches right here to really kind of secure it, so I get a little closer. So even on this wall hanging, I'm going down to about 1/4 of an inch. Now I make sure that I have a stitch right before I get to that miter. And then I'm going to go down, and I'm actually going to come up right here. So I'm going to go down underneath the whole miter, and I'm going to come up kind of at the top of my quilt. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that same stitch, and I'm going to stitch that miter down. Because in the past, if I would just stitch here and go across, there would be like a gap there, and I felt like it wasn't as secure. So I'm going to turn this around a little bit. I'm going to take a tiny stitch and go up. And so I'm actually securing this miter so that it's really not going to budge when I'm done. And then when I get to the bottom, I'll take a close little stitch right there. So now my miter is actually secured, and I just feel like kids, you know, they're not going to pull that apart. And then I'll take a few smaller stitches right here just to really secure that. And that's probably about all I need to show you, because from here on out it's the same thing. I'm just going to keep stitching. I'm going to do the same thing at every corner with the miter. You have a beautiful crisp look on the front of your quilt because you've ironed it, and that miter just looks really pretty on the other side as well. But that's how I hand stitch my quilt bindings to the back, and I hope some of these ideas will help you as you use this method. I know it's faster to do both sides by machine, but I just really love sitting with my quilt after it's finished, slowing down, enjoying my quilt, and taking the time to do this hand stitching. I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial on how to hand stitch binding. Now remember that you'll need to go watch the binding tutorial part 1 and binding tutorial part 2 if you need help with actually sewing your binding by machine to the front of your quilt, and then finish up with today's video for all of the finishing tips and tricks. If you enjoyed today's video, I hope you'll share it with a friend. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the like button, and thanks so much for stopping by.